A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, Stephen McAlpine is an award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Stephen's back with us. Hey, Stephen, welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you, Neil.
Stephen, we might be surprised that the Last Supper would even be featured or portrayed as part of French history. Did you have what's your bigger overall reflection here?
Well, apart from the fact that it's by an Italian painter, I guess the question is, in such opening ceremonies, what you try to do if you're an artistic director is find as many of the common cultural references you can and use those to explain what you're doing. It's not much point, I think, using cultural references that people don't understand. And I think that's what's been here, that they've taken something that people automatically know because it's so famous. It's like the Mona Lisa. It's so famous that it gets parodied all the time, and they just kind of up that a little bit, well, more than a little bit, with what they did.
Okay, so something, though, perhaps around the perception of modern culture, and is it modern French culture alone, or is it Western culture everywhere, a highly sexualised, even some saying satanic display of hedonism in that particular portrayal? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, look, I think I've seen people say, well, it clearly wasn't the Last Supper. It's a picture of the Greek gods that we know, and we go, well, we don't know that picture as well as we know the Last Supper. It's certainly flagrant, and that's what I would say. I don't want us to be absolutely, totally angry about everything all the time, but I think as Christians we should be vexed by it. So, in one sense, there's no. Glenn Scrivener said the most subversive, shocking thing that ever happened to Jesus was the crucifixion, and everything else is, a ripple of that effect. And that's what I think you're seeing here. But I do think there's something about the fact that we use, that we both, in that scene, they denigrate the Saviour, but at the same time they denigrate an understanding of creation. It is using post-Christian and pre-Christian, I think, sexualised ideas about using the Last Supper. So I think it's disingenuous to say it wasn't meant to be the Last Supper. It clearly was. And I also think there's something disturbing about the post-Christian framework of thumbing its nose at the history that's been given to it and the framework of thinking in the West. And I think that's central to it. And France is certainly at the forefront of that.
And I think you rightly bring out that our response is what's very important here. You can either be angry or you could see opportunity. I mean, clearly an attack on Christianity, but it's something that perhaps that minority who included that in the presentation did it for provocation reasons. They wanted to provoke a reaction.
Yeah, of course they did. And look, I think it's right to be vexed by it. You read in 2 Peter that Lot is vexed by the life of Sodom and Gomorrah. So I don't think there's anything wrong with saying I'm vexed by that. There's a cultural moment for some Christians who sort of say, well, I'm too cool for school. That doesn't annoy me. I expect this. And I go, yeah, but it's not right. It's not good. It's showcasing something that's blasphemous and celebrating it. And it cost millions of dollars to put together. This is well thought through. At the same time, I'm saying there are gospel opportunities from it, but perhaps not from the places we think. Most of the people I speak to who are quiet, gentle, who are not Christian, are looking at the culture are going, there's something wrong here. What's going on? So I don't think the primary gospel target is necessarily the people running the event, but it is certainly people saying, why would Christians not be concerned that happened? And I think there's an opening there for people. I don't think we need to be highly offended all the time, but I do think we need to be vexed by it because it is wrong. And Paul himself was indignant at the idolatry of Athens to the point that he told the gospel, but he was indignant by it.
I note that there's been some apology that's come from those authorities in organising the opening ceremony from France. But the statement's out there. Once it's out there, it's out there. More of a political propaganda statement and raising this image of the LGBTIQ community. In some sense here, though, when we're actually applying our own emotions and perhaps even that overflowing to a little bit of anger here, because we might have thought that the opening of the biggest sporting event in the world, which would be also aimed at a new generation of sports young men and women coming through and children aspiring to be like their heroes, that somehow or other it ought to have been G-rated. And there was no warning at the start of it, was there? So what are your thoughts about just the adult content that is there and exposing kids around the world to that adult content?
Well, given that most secular government frameworks in education today are teaching adult content to primary school kids about sex and gender, I guess you shouldn't be surprised. So I think the horse has bolted in terms of what's G-rated these days for many people. And I think the other thing too is that the Olympics are a homage to beauty, the cult of beauty and brilliance, and bringing people together outside of any spiritual framework under the worship of the body. It's not hard to look at the athletes in general, apart from maybe the heaviest weightlifters, and go, this is about the worship of the body. And you see the Instagram accounts of young, beautiful people flexing, and you go, this is about body worship at some level. It's about how can we be our most babyish and show ourselves the best. And look, there are great things about sport. There's plenty of Christians there. But if you think about it, that a place that nations that are very Christianized and conservative are there, and you think about Fiji and places like that where they were singing beautiful songs in their hotel rooms, you think, why would the French want to slap down anyone who doesn't hold the same worldview as them? I think it was poor. And the fact that, too, that they sang John Lennon's Imagine at the ceremony is exactly what they did at the start of the delayed 2021 Olympics. It seems interesting that the same song comes up into Olympics as a key song in the opening ceremony.
As you say, they choose iconic paintings or iconic songs, and some people will see that John Lennon song Imagine as something of an iconic song, but it actually is a very humanistic song. It's, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. It sows a seed of doubt for those who do have faith. But it's this sort of humanistic religion that drives the use of a song like that, no doubt.
Well, the fact is it isn't easy if you try. To say, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try, that's not easy. You have to build a whole edifice to suppress the fact that there is something beyond this age. You have to pour a lot of money and time and effort, and you have to run programs, you have to have festivals to try and suppress the fact that there is something beyond this age. And something like the Olympics is absolutely well prepped to be that kind of place, to be the kind of place that says, it's easy if you try. Well, no, we spent millions of dollars proving it. So it's not easy if you try. And I think that as Christians, there are places and spaces for us to talk to people and say, do you actually think that this is the pinnacle of what it means to be human? Because the gospel doesn't say that that's what the pinnacle of being human is. The pinnacle man is not a gold medalist. It's a man hung on a cross. It's a very different way of looking at the world.
There's some other lyrics in that song by John Lennon, Imagine, imagining no religion too. And when you imagine no religion, and let's just bring into that the context of no Christianity, which has brought about that flourishing of civilizations. You can prove that. But there's an outcome to it. And the outcome may be what we saw in what happened later on with the depiction of the Last Supper. Is this something that may even be a portrayal here of what happens when you actually do ascribe to that humanistic religious nature?
Well, it's interesting that the gospel has so thoroughly shaped the culture. And Tom Holland, the historian, says that the West, the post-Christian West, is still very Christian. And so it can only fight and reject what has taken over the culture. It can't actually, there's nothing transgressive about having a go at something that doesn't capture your popular imagination. And Christianity has so captured our imagination in the West that for anything to be transgressive, it's got to slightly thumb its nose at Christianity because it's the only thing it can thumb its nose at. And I find it really interesting that France is trying to say that our values are somehow neutral, our liberty, equality, fraternity. But really, they're baked into the culture from a Christian framework, and they're trying to do it in a secular way. At the moment in France, they do not know how to deal with religion in the public square. They must shut down someone wearing a cross or a woman wearing a veil because they don't know how to bring or allow religion in the public square. They just don't know how to do it.
One commentator suggests the ceremony was about how Macron sees France, and it may be that when people are organising these sorts of ceremonies and entertainment, that they may be trying to pander to what the leaders in that society might see as what their vision for France might be. Any thoughts around that? Because France is moving all the more left, as you know.
Yeah, and Macron will try to keep it centrist, he thinks, but he's still very humanist. And what France is discovering is that, say, Islam, for example, is massive in France at the moment, and they don't know how to deal with it. And I think it was the hopeful French vision of what the future might look like. I would want to compare it to another great act of pageantry that I think pointed to the opposite, which was the Queen's funeral, which Macron was at. And it was very much the Queen's statement that don't try to imagine there's no heaven above us. There is. And it's that heaven above us that provides a safety net to the overreach of political power. So everything about the Queen's funeral was geared to exactly the opposite of the opening ceremony of the Olympics. It was about self-denial. It was about the service of others, and it was about a God above who controls. And the Olympic opening ceremony was pretty much the opposite of that in that respect, including the beheading of Marie Antoinette, which was sort of parodied as well. So the great irony is that the French culture was promoting and celebrating one of the bloodiest revolutions we've had, which in the end came up with a new goddess figure, the goddess of reason. People are religious no matter what they do. They can't get away from it. And I think that's the goddess of religion today, or the goddess of reason has moved to the goddess of sensuality in our cultural moment.
Stephen, let me take you a little further into the deep end here. Opponents of Christianity think they can mock God and his people without impunity. How do we understand the mocking nature of what we've seen, and Christians and our response, and whether we lay down or whether we rise up, or what sort of action we might take?
I think there's a tension there for Christians, because we go, I want to be vexed by that. I want to say that's wrong. I don't want my children to feel that that is a normal way of living life. But at the same time, the Bible says God is not mocked, and a day of judgment is coming. When he will judge the world with righteousness. And as Paul says in Acts 17, and he's appointed a man, Jesus Christ, who raised from the dead to do that. So what that gives Christians is a way of not being anguished all the time about it, but a way of saying, in sober judgment, let us avoid those sins ourselves, and let us know that God is storing up his righteous judgment for the last day, and commit ourselves to doing good while we wait for it. And that's one of the key features in the letter of 1 Peter. Keep doing what's right and wait for God's judgment. Now, doing right can be evangelism, and I've had people try to bifurcate, well, it's all about evangelism. And I go, yes, it's about evangelism of the private person, but it's also about how we want to see the public square operate as Christians. We have to do good in the public square. We can call things out, but we do it all under the umbrella that one day God will return in Jesus, and he will account for all sin, including the sin of the righteous as well as the unrighteous. And we had to remember that the showcasing of unrighteousness in Paris is not the only unrighteousness in our world. The self-righteousness of those who don't know God or want him is probably our biggest blind spot culturally, especially in the West at the moment.
I note that billionaire Elon Musk chimed in, and he was saying it was disrespectful to Christians, but he added that Christianity has become toothless. And I wonder whether, Jesus' command to turn the other cheek might actually be, for a lot of believers, almost an excuse to remain passive and say nothing, do nothing. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, look, I would say you don't have to be angry, and in the sense of enraged. And when he says toothless, I want to be careful that we don't go down we're going to take this nation back the way we want to, because I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. But I do think, and I've noticed a bunch of younger Christians who are saying, we want to make a difference in the public square. We want to stand up for Christianity, and we don't care if that means we're mocked. Now, I would say that part of the problem for many of my generation of Christians is that we want to be, we just want anything for a quiet life. But I'm noticing a younger generation that are going, no, we're going to stand up and say that's wrong. And if people mock us and pillory us and we don't get the best jobs and we don't get tenure at the university, that's okay. So I'm hopeful that there'll be a generation of Christians that go, no, we're going to show you a different vision of living human life.
And as Christians, I mean, we might even be into a comparison space here where we say we react differently to the way that Islam reacts here, because there's been a lot of people who are saying, well, if they'd have mocked Islam that way, there'd be all sorts of other consequences, and we might not have to look too far back in history, back to the Charlie Hebdo issues and controversies, and depicting Muhammad sat in a satirical way. The Islamic way would have been to react almost with like in the sense of a terror attack. But so we have an opportunity here to actually talk about how Christians respond when this happens. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, look, Greg Sheridan mentioned that in the Australian newspaper today, because he's over at a Catholic forum in the US. And Carl Truman, who knows also at that forum, as Greg Sheridan pointed out. And Greg said, yeah, it would be a different response with Islam, but that's not to say that we should get up and shock Muslims for the sake of it. But you have to understand that I get into an Uber with a young Muslim taxi driver who wants to talk about Jesus, and the one thing they won't contemplate is that Jesus died on the cross in shame. They believe that God took him off the cross and put Judas there in his place because they don't have a theology of weakness, and that strength comes out of the weakness, and that somehow there's an irony of that. So Islam does not have a framework for thinking like that. So if you did do something that mocked Islam, the only response must be retribution, I think, because Christianity has a different framework. The tension for us is we want to say the gospel is made perfect in the weakness of the cross, but also we are going to stand and say that's wrong. And that's a purely Christian response to these sorts of things. I don't think other theological or other religious frameworks have that, and Islam certainly doesn't, because it doesn't have a crucified Messiah like we do.
Identify what's wrong and respond in some ways here, aligned with an identity we have in Christ. Hey, The Paris Olympic Committee has apologised for the segments, and they say no intention at all to disrespect any religious group. I wonder what we might then expect at a closing ceremony, because that might be all telling, because if they haven't fixed it by then, we'll know that was all, a bit of charade.
Well, they're scrambling around. I think it's hilarious that 53 different people are saying different things about it, which just proves that they had not thought this through. They hadn't thought through the process. Or perhaps they had thought through the process and thought it was funny, because lots of people are saying it wasn't the Last Supper, and then you read statements that say this was part of the process, was to depict a mash-up between Greek and Christian mythologies and kind of poke fun at it. And I go, if you're the artistic director being paid squillions of dollars, you should know your game pretty early. And I think they're just making excuses. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the closing ceremony, though they tend to be more celebratory and less sort of showcasing the French culture, and they're sort of more just about a party. But we'll see what happens, I suppose. They've got a couple of weeks to get it right.
And Stephen, have you written any articles about this any time recently? Yes, you have?
Yeah,
yes.
Indeed. Yeah.
So when we point listeners to your website, StephenMcAlpine.com, they'll be able to see some of these sorts of thoughts, and perhaps even just start to get a framework around how we might respond to such attacks like this. So StephenMcAlpine.com is Stephen's website. Stephen McAlpine is an award-winning Christian author, pastor, and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Stephen, great insights. Thanks so much for sharing those with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be with you as always.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.